1958, May. Elizabeth Taylor's Beverly Hills home. Debbie Reynolds walked into Elizabeth Taylor's house and immediately felt something was wrong. The atmosphere was different, charged with an energy she couldn't quite name. Elizabeth sat in the living room, hair disheveled, no makeup, still mourning, but beside her sat Eddie Fisher, Debbie's husband. Eddie was kneeling next to Elizabeth on the floor, looking through a photo album with her, Mike Todd's photographs. Elizabeth was crying, and Eddie kept touching her shoulder to comfort her. Debbie stood in the doorway and watched. There was something about the way Eddie touched Elizabeth. Too long, too gentle, too close. "Hello," Debbie said, her voice slightly harder than usual. Eddie jumped to his feet, guilt flashing across his face. "Debbie, you're here, wonderful. But Elizabeth's having a really bad day. I was just keeping her company." Elizabeth looked at Debbie. Something flickered in her eyes, shame or defiance. Debbie couldn't tell. "Eddie, we need to go home," Debbie said firmly. "The children are waiting for us." Eddie hesitated. For a moment he looked at Elizabeth, then at Debbie. "Of course," he finally said. "Let's go." But as they got into the car, Debbie saw Eddie turn back to look at Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was looking at him too. An invisible thread seemed to stretch between them, taut and undeniable. That night, when they got home, Debbie cried, because now she knew. Her husband was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. 4 months later, in September, the scandal exploded. Eddie Fisher left Debbie Reynolds for Elizabeth Taylor, and America lost its mind. But what shocked everyone most wasn't the affair itself. It was Debbie's response. Because when Debbie Reynolds stood before the press, abandoned by her husband and betrayed by her best friend, she did something no one expected. She forgave them both. And in doing so, she transformed Hollywood's biggest scandal into a masterclass in grace under pressure. Before we dive into this incredible story, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the untold truths behind Hollywood's most legendary moments. Your support helps us preserve these stories for future generations. To understand how 3 of Hollywood's brightest stars ended up in its darkest scandal, we need to go back to before Mike Todd's death, before the affair, before everything fell apart. Back to when Elizabeth Taylor, Debbie Reynolds, and Eddie Fisher were simply friends navigating the complicated world of fame. Elizabeth Taylor in early 1958 was riding high. At 26 years old, she'd already been married twice, starred in dozens of films, and become one of the most beautiful women in the world. Her third marriage to producer Mike Todd was different from the others. Mike was larger than life, charismatic, passionate, and he worshipped Elizabeth. For the first time, Elizabeth felt truly loved, not for her beauty, but for herself. Mike treated her like a queen, showered her with attention and jewelry, especially diamonds. The famous ring he gave her was a symbol of their love, extravagant and bold, just like their relationship. Debbie Reynolds was America's sweetheart, at 26, the same age as Elizabeth, and Debbie had built her career on wholesome roles and a girl-next-door image. She'd starred in Singin' in the Rain, married singer Eddie Fisher in A Fairy Tale Wedding, and had 2 young children, Carrie and Todd. To the public, Debbie and Eddie were the perfect couple, young, talented, in love. But behind closed doors, cracks were already forming. Eddie felt overshadowed by Debbie's success. He wanted to be a star in his own right, not just Debbie Reynolds' husband. Eddie Fisher was one of America's most popular singers in the 1950s. His voice was smooth, his looks were boyish, and teenage girls screamed at his concerts. But Eddie had a restless energy, a need for validation that Debbie's steady love couldn't quite satisfy. He craved excitement, drama, the kind of intensity that Debbie, with her practical Midwestern sensibility, didn't naturally provide. When Eddie met Mike Todd, the two became close friends, and through Mike, Eddie entered Elizabeth Taylor's orbit. It was a dangerous place for a man who confused excitement with love. The friendship between the 3 couples, Elizabeth and Mike, Debbie and Eddie, seemed natural. They were young Hollywood royalty, attending the same parties, dining at the same restaurants, living the glamorous life that magazines celebrated. Elizabeth and Debbie genuinely liked each other. They were different. Elizabeth sophisticated and sensual, Debbie wholesome and energetic. But that difference created balance. They could talk, laugh, share the unique pressures of fame. Neither suspected that soon they'd be fighting over the same man. March 22nd, 1958. Mike Todd's private plane, the Lucky Liz, crashed in New Mexico during a storm. Everyone on board perished. Elizabeth was supposed to be on that flight but stayed home with a cold. When she received the news, her world shattered. The guilt was overwhelming. Why had Mike died while she lived? Why hadn't she been there with him? The questions tormented her through sleepless nights and grief-stricken days. Debbie Reynolds was one of the first people to reach Elizabeth after the tragedy. She held her friend as Elizabeth sobbed, stayed with her through the funeral, helped manage the overwhelming press attention. Eddie Fisher was there too, ever present, supportive, the devoted friend. In those early weeks of mourning, no one thought anything suspicious about Eddie's constant presence at Elizabeth's home. He was being a good friend, helping a widow through her darkest days. Debbie encouraged it. Elizabeth needed support, and Eddie was providing it. It all seemed so innocent. But something was happening beneath the surface, something neither Eddie nor Elizabeth fully understood at first. Grief creates vulnerability, and vulnerability creates intimacy. Elizabeth, raw with loss, found comfort in Eddie's attention. Eddie, feeling needed in a way Debbie's independence never required, found purpose in comforting Elizabeth. They talked for hours about Mike, about loss, about life. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, those conversations became less about Mike and more about each other. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. By June, 3 months after Mike's death, Eddie was spending more time at Elizabeth's house than his own. He'd tell Debbie he was helping Elizabeth with business matters, sorting through Mike's estate, being a supportive friend, and Debbie, trusting and kind-hearted, believed him. But the midnight phone calls, the distracted looks, the way Eddie said Elizabeth's name with a tenderness he no longer used for Debbie, all of it told a different story. One night, Debbie couldn't ignore it anymore. She followed Eddie's voice to the living room and heard him on the phone, speaking in hushed, intimate tones. "Elizabeth, you're special to me. After Mike left, I feel empty too, like we could fill that emptiness together." Debbie's heart stopped. This wasn't friendship, this was love. Or at least, what Eddie thought was love. Debbie stood frozen, listening to her husband fall for another woman, her best friend, and felt something inside her break. She could have confronted him that night, screamed, cried, demanded an explanation. But Debbie Reynolds had been raised to be practical, to think before acting. So she went back to bed, lay awake until dawn, and made a decision. She would give Eddie a chance to end it himself, to come to his senses, to choose his family. It was a gamble, and Debbie knew it. But she still believed in the man she'd married, still hoped he'd remember what they'd built together. The affair continued through summer. Hollywood whispered but didn't yet shout. Elizabeth and Eddie were seen together at restaurants, at parties, always with plausible explanations. They were discussing Mike's legacy, planning a tribute, just friends supporting each other, but their friends knew better. The way they looked at each other, the way they found reasons to touch, the way the air seemed to crackle when they were in the same room. It all screamed, affair. August. Debbie finally confronted Eddie, not with anger, but with heartbreaking honesty. "Are you in love with her?" she asked simply. Eddie, to his credit, didn't lie. "I don't know," he said. "I care about her deeply. She needs me, Debbie. She's so lost without Mike." Debbie felt her world crumble. "What about your children, Eddie? What about Carrie and Todd? Don't they need you?" Eddie looked away. "They have you. You're strong, Debbie. Elizabeth isn't. She needs someone to take care of her." That conversation revealed the truth Debbie had been avoiding. Eddie didn't want a partner. He wanted someone to save, someone who made him feel necessary, heroic, important. Debbie's independence and strength, the very qualities that made her successful, made Eddie feel superfluous. Elizabeth's vulnerability gave him purpose. It was a painful realization, but it brought Debbie clarity. She couldn't compete with Elizabeth's grief, and she wouldn't beg Eddie to stay. If he wanted to leave, she'd let him go with dignity. September 10, 1958. Eddie Fisher held a press conference and announced he was leaving Debbie Reynolds for Elizabeth Taylor. The scandal erupted like a bomb. Newspapers screamed headlines, radio shows debated the morality, churches condemned the affair from pulpits. America, which had idolized Eddie and Debbie as the perfect couple, felt personally betrayed. Eddie Fisher became one of the most hated men in the country overnight. His record sales plummeted, concert venues canceled bookings. The public backlash was swift and merciless. Elizabeth Taylor faced even harsher judgment. The press, which had sympathized with her as a grieving widow, now called her a homewrecker, a husband stealer, a woman who seduced her best friend's husband. Letters poured in, many of them vicious, calling Elizabeth names, threatening her, demanding she leave Hollywood in shame. Non-studio executives panicked, worried that Elizabeth's scandal would destroy her career and their investments in her upcoming films. The woman who'd been untouchable just months before was now Hollywood's most controversial figure. Have you ever had to show grace to someone who hurt you deeply? Share your thoughts in the comments below. But the biggest surprise came from Debbie Reynolds. Everyone expected her to lash out, to play the victim, to condemn Eddie and Elizabeth publicly. That's what wronged wives did in Hollywood. They gave tearful interviews, painted themselves as innocent martyrs, destroyed their rivals' reputations. Debbie could have buried Elizabeth and Eddie with a single vindictive interview. America would have rallied behind her, turned Eddie and Elizabeth into pariahs, ensured they never worked in Hollywood again. Instead, Debbie did something revolutionary. She called a press conference and faced dozens of reporters with calm dignity. Flashbulbs popped, microphones crowded her. Every journalist expected tears, recriminations, anger. But Debbie sat straight, looked directly at the cameras, and spoke with quiet strength. I want to address what everyone is talking about. Yes, Eddie has left me for Elizabeth. Yes, it hurts deeply, but I want to say something important. I forgive Eddie. I forgive Elizabeth, because real love cannot be controlled. And I want my children's father to be happy, even if that happiness isn't with me. The room went silent. Reporters exchanged confused glances. This wasn't the story they'd expected. Debbie continued, Eddie and I married young. We've grown in different directions. If he's found happiness with Elizabeth, then I wish them both well. My focus now is on my children and my career. I'm moving forward with grace and gratitude for what Eddie and I shared. It was a masterpiece of public relations, whether intentional or not. In one statement, Debbie transformed herself from victim to victor. She took the moral high ground so completely that Eddie and Elizabeth looked petty and cruel by comparison. The public, which had been ready to crucify all three of them, instead rallied around Debbie. She became America's symbol of dignified strength, the wronged woman who refused to be broken. Her career didn't just survive the scandal, it thrived. But Debbie's grace wasn't just strategy, though her advisors recognized its brilliance. It came from genuine understanding. Debbie had seen Eddie's restlessness, his need to feel necessary, and his confusion of intensity with love. She'd known the marriage was struggling before Elizabeth appeared. Mike Todd's death simply accelerated what might have happened eventually. Debbie chose to control the narrative of her own life rather than let scandal define her. Years later, Debbie admitted the truth was more complicated. Was I hurt? Absolutely. Did I feel betrayed? Of course. But holding on to anger would only poison me. Eddie made his choice. Elizabeth made hers. I chose my children, my career, and my self-respect. The marriage of Eddie Fisher and Elizabeth Taylor lasted 5 years, from 1959 to 1964. It was tumultuous from the start. Eddie thought being with Elizabeth would make him feel important. Instead, he felt overshadowed by her fame. Reduced to Elizabeth Taylor's husband rather than Eddie Fisher, the star. Elizabeth recognized fairly quickly that Eddie wasn't another Mike Todd. He didn't have Mike's strength or charisma. By 1962, when Elizabeth met Richard Burton on the Cleopatra set, she was ready for someone different, someone who could match her fire. And once again, Elizabeth left one marriage for the promise of passion with someone new. When Elizabeth left Eddie for Richard Burton in 1964, creating yet another scandal, there was a delicious irony. Eddie Fisher, who'd left Debbie Reynolds for Elizabeth Taylor, was now the one being left. He experienced the pain he'd inflicted on Debbie, the humiliation, the public mockery, the sense of being discarded for someone more exciting. And this time, there was no sympathy for him. The public remembered how he'd abandoned Debbie and felt he was simply getting what he deserved. But perhaps the most remarkable part of this story is what happened decades later. In 2001, Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor reconciled after 40 years of silence. They met at a party, looked at each other across the room, and something shifted. Elizabeth approached Debbie and said simply, "I'm sorry for everything." Debbie looked at the woman who'd once been her best friend and greatest betrayer and felt the old anger dissolve. "We were all so young," Debbie replied. "We all made mistakes." They talked for hours that night, finding common ground in their shared experiences as mothers, actresses, and women who'd survived Hollywood's cruelty. Their reconciliation shocked Hollywood, but it made perfect sense to anyone who understood forgiveness. Debbie had forgiven Eddie and Elizabeth decades earlier, not for their sake, but for her own peace. Meeting Elizabeth again simply allowed her to express that forgiveness directly. And Elizabeth, who'd carried guilt about the affair for years despite her defensive public statements, finally received the absolution she needed. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more untold Hollywood histories, and tell us, do you think true forgiveness is possible after such deep betrayal? The Eddie Fisher, Debbie Reynolds, Elizabeth Taylor scandal was Hollywood's biggest story of 1958. It had everything the public craved: beauty, betrayal, heartbreak, and high drama. But beneath the headlines was a more human story about three people navigating love, loss, and loyalty under impossible circumstances. Eddie Fisher, insecure and seeking purpose. Elizabeth Taylor, grieving and vulnerable, mistaking comfort for love. Debbie Reynolds, practical and resilient, choosing dignity over destruction. Debbie lived to be 84, working almost until her final day, beloved by generations who admired her talent and her strength. She raised Carrie Fisher, who became a legendary actress and writer in her own right, carrying forward her mother's resilience and wit. Eddie Fisher's career never recovered from the scandal. He lived the rest of his life diminished, a cautionary tale about confusing excitement for love and need for genuine connection. Elizabeth Taylor married Richard Burton twice, divorced him twice, married 6 times total, always searching for the grand passion she'd lost when Mike Todd died. The lesson of their story isn't about judgment. It's about the complexity of human emotion, the impossibility of controlling who we love, and the power of choosing how we respond when life breaks our hearts. Debbie Reynolds could have let scandal destroy her. Instead, she let it refine her, turning betrayal into strength, humiliation into dignity, pain into purpose. In the end, the three people at the center of Hollywood's biggest scandal taught us something valuable. Love is complicated, betrayal is painful, but grace, genuine grace, is transformative. Debbie Reynolds proved that you can be hurt deeply and still choose kindness. You can be betrayed publicly and still maintain dignity. You can lose the battle for someone's heart and still win the war for your own soul. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing a person can do. The day Debbie Reynolds forgave Elizabeth Taylor and Eddie Fisher, she didn't just survive Hollywood's biggest scandal. She transcended it, becoming something more than a wronged wife or abandoned spouse. She became a symbol of the power we all have to choose grace over bitterness, dignity over revenge, and forgiveness over hatred. And decades later, when she and Elizabeth finally reconciled, Debbie proved that some wounds, no matter how deep, can heal if we're brave enough to let them.